The air inside Giovanni's prime always carried an unmistakable blend of luxury and intimidation. Crystal chandeliers reflected off polished mahogany tables, wealthy patrons sipped vintage wine beneath soft jazz melodies, and every detail whispered exclusivity. Yet on certain evenings, another scent lingered in the room: fear. Conversations died the moment the brass doors swung open, glasses paused halfway to trembling lips, and even the seasoned waitstaff instinctively lowered their eyes. Everyone recognized the arrival of Dominic Russo, the man whose fortune in real estate concealed an empire built on violence. As the undisputed ruler of Chicago's criminal underworld, Dominic commanded respect without asking for it. His presence alone was enough to silence an entire restaurant. Flanked by his loyal enforcers Victor and Leo, he claimed the same corner booth every visit, choosing the seat that allowed him to watch every entrance and every possible escape. No one questioned his routine because everyone understood the price of disappointing him. Among the anxious employees stood Clara Jenkins, a 26-year-old waitress whose confidence contrasted sharply with the fear surrounding her. Standing 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighing 260 pounds, Clara had spent her entire life enduring judgment before people ever bothered to know her. Cruel jokes about her size had followed her through childhood, high school, and adulthood, leaving scars far deeper than words could reveal. Over time, however, those experiences forged an unshakable resilience instead of insecurity. She refused to apologize for the space she occupied or allow anyone else to define her worth. Working long shifts at Giovanni's was never her dream, but the steady income helped pay for her mother's ongoing physical therapy back in Ohio, making every exhausting day a sacrifice she willingly accepted. While many people saw only her body, Clara carried herself with quiet dignity, sharp intelligence, and a fearless sense of humor that often caught others off guard. When the nervous manager informed her that Dominic Russo would be seated in her section, panic spread across his face as he begged her to avoid eye contact, take the order, and leave without saying another word. Clara simply smiled, tied her apron a little tighter, and assured him that even the most feared man in Chicago still put on his pants one leg at a time. Her calm response only deepened everyone's anxiety. They knew Dominic had destroyed businesses over smaller insults, and none of them wanted to witness another display of his infamous temper. As Clara approached the table, carrying a pitcher of ice water and a leather-bound menu, Dominic barely acknowledged her greeting. Instead, his cold gray eyes slowly traveled over her body, lingering with open contempt, before a cruel smile curled across his face. Loud enough for nearby diners to hear, he mocked the restaurant for hiring someone who looked more like a parade float than a waitress, drawing uncomfortable laughter from Leo while Victor smirked silently beside him. The surrounding tables fell into an uneasy silence as customers looked away, unwilling to become part of the spectacle. Public humiliation was one of Dominic's favorite weapons, and he expected the plus-sized waitress to lower her head in shame like everyone else before him. Instead, Clara responded with complete composure. Without changing her expression, she continued pouring ice water into Dominic's glass until it overflowed, spilling across the pristine white tablecloth and soaking the sleeve of his custom-made designer suit. The icy water dripped from his expensive cuff as he shot to his feet in disbelief, fury flashing across his face. Victor instinctively reached inside his jacket while Leo stared at Clara as though she had lost her mind. Yet Clara remained perfectly calm. Offering a sweet apology that barely concealed her sarcasm, she remarked that she had assumed a man with such an enormous ego could surely handle a little extra volume. Her words landed harder than the cold water ever could, leaving the restaurant frozen in absolute silence. Dominic stepped closer until only inches separated them, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as he reminded Clara exactly who he was. He warned that a single order from him could erase her from the city before her shift ended. Although fear pounded inside her chest, Clara refused to let it appear on her face. Looking directly into his eyes, she answered that unless he truly intended to pull the trigger, he should sit down and tell her how he wanted his steak cooked because she had other customers waiting. For several agonizing seconds, the most feared man in Chicago simply stared at the woman who refused to surrender an inch of her dignity. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he slowly sat back down and ordered his meal. It was the first time anyone in the restaurant had witnessed Dominic Russo retreat from a confrontation rather than dominate it. Clara walked back toward the kitchen with steady steps, but the moment the swinging doors closed behind her, her knees nearly gave way beneath her. She leaned against the stainless steel counter, finally allowing herself to breathe as the terrified manager demanded to know whether she had completely lost her mind. Clara admitted she understood exactly how dangerous Dominic was, yet she refused to spend her life bowing to bullies simply because they possessed money, guns, or power. Deep inside, However, she realized she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Hours later, after Dominic and his men finished dinner, Clara cleared their table, expecting nothing more than empty glasses and dirty plates. Instead, beneath a crisp $100 bill, rested a neatly folded napkin bearing a single handwritten sentence in elegant cursive. "You have a big mouth for a fat girl. I'll enjoy shutting it." Clara read the message twice before quietly folding the napkin and slipping it into her apron pocket. She understood immediately that the confrontation was far from over. Rather than ending with a spilled glass of water, it had only awakened the dangerous curiosity of Chicago's most ruthless crime boss. As she locked the restaurant doors that night and stepped into the cold streets alone, Clara realized she had become the newest target of a man who had never accepted defeat, and she had no idea how far Dominic Russo was willing to go to make her keel. The handwritten threat Dominic Russo left behind should have frightened Clara into submission. Instead, it became the opening move in a psychological chess match neither of them had anticipated. True to his reputation, Dominic never forgot an insult, especially one delivered in front of witnesses. Yet he surprised everyone by refusing to retaliate with violence. Rather than making Clara disappear, he returned to Giovanni's Prime the very next afternoon, requesting the exact same corner booth and insisting that only Clara serve his table. From that day forward, his visits became almost ritualistic. Whether it was lunch, dinner, or a late-night whiskey meeting with associates, Dominic always appeared as though the restaurant had become less about business and more about an invisible battlefield where only two competitors truly mattered. Every visit brought a fresh attempt to chip away at Clara's confidence. Dominic mastered the art of humiliation without ever raising his voice. He would stretch his long legs into the narrow aisle, forcing Clara to squeeze past while his companions watched with smug amusement. He questioned whether the kitchen still had enough food left after her shift, commented that the booths seemed to shrink whenever she approached, and loudly criticized the restaurant's standards simply because she happened to be the waitress assigned to him. His remarks were carefully crafted, not childish insults but calculated attacks meant to reopen every wound society had inflicted on her since childhood. Dominic believed that eventually she would crack like everyone else. Every person he had ever encountered had a breaking point. Wealth, intimidation, and persistence always won in the end. Clara, however, refused to play by his rules. She answered cruelty with intelligence instead of anger, transforming each attempt at humiliation into an opportunity to embarrass him in return. When Dominic deliberately left a glossy gym membership brochure instead of a tip, Clara quietly donated $20 to a local pig rescue organization using his full name. The following evening, she taped the charity's thank you certificate directly onto the reserved sign waiting at his table. Victor struggled to suppress a grin while Leo stared at the paper in complete disbelief. Dominic simply folded the certificate, slipped it into his pocket, and continued eating without saying a word. The silence somehow made the exchange even more satisfying. A few days later, Dominic complained loudly that the restaurant should consider reinforcing the booths before someone of Clara's gravitational influence collapsed the furniture. Clara smiled pleasantly, disappeared into the storage room, and returned carrying a brightly colored child's booster seat. Setting it gently beside Dominic, she asked whether sitting a little higher might finally make him feel like a bigger man. For a heartbeat, the entire dining room froze before muffled laughter escaped from several nearby tables. Dominic's jaw tightened so visibly that even Victor looked away, pretending intense interest in the wine list. Clara simply continued taking orders as though nothing unusual had happened. Word of their increasingly outrageous confrontations spread throughout Giovanni's Prime. Regular customers quietly requested tables with a clear view of Dominic's corner booth, hoping to witness the next verbal duel. The waitstaff began placing discreet bets over who would win each encounter. Even Paulie, who had initially feared the restaurant would be burned to the ground, found himself secretly admiring Clara's refusal to surrender. What had begun as outright hostility slowly evolved into a bizarre contest of pride. Neither Clara nor Dominic was willing to concede even the smallest victory, and each exchange only intensified the strange fascination growing between them. The more Dominic tried to dominate Clara, the more she unsettled him. He had spent years surrounded by politicians eager for favors, businessmen desperate for contracts, and criminals terrified of disappointing him. Everyone measured every word they spoke in his presence. Clara alone behaved as though his wealth, reputation, and criminal empire were meaningless. She never flirted with him, never begged for mercy, and never accepted special treatment. To her, Dominic Russo remained nothing more than another customer with an oversized ego and an expensive suit. That indifference irritated him more deeply than open hatred ever could. Away from the restaurant, Clara's life looked nothing like the confidence she projected each evening. She returned after exhausting shifts to a cramped apartment on 43rd Street, where freezing air slipped through cracked windows because her landlord continually ignored requests to repair the broken radiator. Every month became a balancing act between paying rent, buying groceries, and sending money to Ohio, where her mother struggled through expensive physical therapy after a devastating accident. Walking away from Giovanni's Prime was never a realistic option. No matter how unbearable Dominic became, Clara needed every dollar she earned. She refused to let hardship become an excuse for surrender. Her difficult circumstances only strengthened her determination to protect the dignity no one else had ever willingly given her. Dominic gradually noticed something that disturbed his assumptions. Clara could not be bribed. Larger tips failed to impress her. Expensive compliments rolled off her shoulders as easily as cruel insults. Threats earned only sharper replies. She seemed immune to every form of influence that had built his empire. For the first time in years, Dominic encountered someone who valued self-respect above money, fear, or social status. Instead of weakening his obsession, the discovery only deepened it. He found himself watching her carry heavy serving trays across the dining room with effortless confidence, noticing the way customers smiled more genuinely around her than they ever did around him. Against his own expectations, admiration slowly crept beneath his frustration. Their dangerous rivalry took an unexpected turn on a cold, rain-soaked Thursday evening. Business had nearly ended when the restaurant doors burst open and two enormous men strode inside without hesitation. Liam and Sean O'Connor were notorious debt collectors working for Declan Gallagher, the ruthless leader of Chicago's Irish mob. Their scarred faces and violent reputations were enough to silence every remaining employee. Ignoring Clara completely, they demanded to see Polly, accusing the restaurant of falling behind on protection payments. Clara immediately sensed something far more serious than an unpaid debt. Giovanni's operated inside Russo territory. If Gallagher's men were collecting money here, an underground war was about to erupt. When the brothers attempted to force their way toward the manager's office, Clara instinctively stepped into the hallway, blocking their path with surprising confidence. She calmly informed them that the restaurant was closed and that they needed to leave immediately. Liam laughed at the sight of the plus-sized waitress trying to stand in their way. Without warning, he shoved her violently backward. Clara slammed into a serving station as glasses exploded across the floor, sharp fragments slicing into her legs. Ignoring the pain, she grabbed the nearest heavy ketchup bottle and warned them not to touch her again. Sean responded by drawing a hunting knife, his expression promising far worse than intimidation. Before either man could move, the restaurant entrance exploded inward. Rain whipped through the shattered doorway as Dominic Russo stepped inside his tailored coat, dripping onto the marble floor. Victor and Leo followed close behind, their pistols already drawn. The atmosphere changed instantly. Even the O'Connor brothers hesitated, recognizing the far more dangerous predator now standing before them. Dominic's voice remained calm, almost conversational, as he ordered Sean to drop the knife. When the Irish enforcer refused, Dominic crossed the room with astonishing speed. Within seconds, Sean's wrist snapped beneath Dominic's grip. His face collided violently with an upward knee strike, and he collapsed unconscious in a pool of blood. Victor pressed his pistol against Liam's head before the terrified collector could even reach for his weapon. Dominic ordered the brothers to carry their injured companion back to Gallagher, with a message no one could misunderstand. If the Irish mob entered Russo territory again, they would not be leaving alive. Once the intruders disappeared into the storm, Dominic turned toward Clara. Blood trickled down her leg where broken glass had cut through her skin. For a brief moment, concern replaced the usual arrogance in his expression as he reached out to brush a loose strand of hair away from her face. Clara immediately slapped his hand aside, refusing to mistake gratitude for dependence. Dominic's pride quickly resurfaced. Leaning close enough that only she could hear him, he reminded Clara that he had just saved her life. Most women, he claimed, would already be on their knees thanking him. The challenge hung heavily between them. Clara looked down at the small amount of blood collecting on her lip, then calmly spat a crimson drop onto the polished leather of Dominic's handcrafted Italian shoe. Looking directly into his eyes, she declared that she would never kneel before a man who believed fear could purchase respect. Genuine respect, she said, had to be earned, not demanded. For the first time since entering the restaurant weeks earlier, Dominic had no response. He stared silently at the blood staining his expensive shoe before lifting his eyes to meet Clara's unwavering gaze. Something profound shifted inside him at that moment. The humiliation he expected to impose had become his own. Without another word, he turned and walked into the rain, leaving everyone inside the restaurant speechless. The following Monday, an impeccably dressed attorney arrived, before opening hours carrying legal documents that changed everything. Gathering the confused employees together, he politely informed them that Giovanni's Prime had officially been purchased by Russo Enterprises over the weekend. Polly was no longer the owner. Every paycheck, every decision, and every corner of the restaurant now belonged to Dominic Russo. As Clara looked around the dining room she had considered her safest place for years, a quiet realization settled over her. Their rivalry was no longer confined to a customer and a waitress. Dominic had purchased the battlefield itself, and whatever game they had been playing had just entered a far more dangerous chapter. After Russo Enterprises officially acquired Giovanni's Prime, everyone expected Dominic Russo to tighten his grip on the restaurant and make Clara's life unbearable. Instead, something even more unsettling happened. The insults stopped. The sarcastic remarks disappeared. He no longer mocked her appearance or left cruel reminders of his contempt. Every afternoon he arrived with Victor and Leo settled into the same corner booth, ordered his usual meal, and spent hours silently watching the dining room. His cold gray eyes followed Clara as she balanced heavy serving trays across the polished floor, greeted customers with effortless warmth, and laughed with coworkers despite the endless pressure surrounding her. He rarely spoke unless necessary, yet his constant attention made Clara far more uncomfortable than his insults ever had. Hatred was predictable. Silence was impossible to understand. At first, Clara tried convincing herself that Dominic had simply grown bored with their rivalry, but every instinct warned her otherwise. She could feel his gaze long before she looked in his direction. Whenever she glanced toward his table, she inevitably found him already watching her with an unreadable expression. It was no longer the arrogant sneer of a man seeking entertainment. Instead, his eyes carried an intense curiosity that left her deeply unsettled. She refused to acknowledge him, focusing entirely on her work, yet the strange tension lingered between them every single day. What neither of them realized was that their increasingly complicated relationship had not gone unnoticed. Across the city, Declan Gallagher carefully collected reports from informants embedded throughout Chicago's underworld. The Irish mob boss viewed Dominic's attack on the O'Connor brothers as a declaration of war, but what truly captured his attention was something far more valuable. Every witness repeated the same unbelievable story. Chicago's most ruthless crime boss had repeatedly intervened whenever a plus-sized waitress named Clara Jenkins found herself in danger. Gallagher laughed at first, dismissing the rumors as exaggerated gossip, but as identical accounts continued arriving from different sources, amusement gave way to calculation. Every empire possessed a weakness. If Dominic Russo had finally developed one, Gallagher intended to exploit it without hesitation. Within days, orders spread through the Irish organization. Clara was no longer an ordinary waitress. She became bait. Whether she was kidnapped or killed mattered little. Gallagher understood that Dominic would never ignore an attack against the woman everyone believed had somehow captured his attention. If Dominic came to rescue her, an ambush would eliminate him. If he stayed away, his reputation for absolute control would collapse. Either outcome served Gallagher perfectly. Several evenings later, Chicago disappeared beneath freezing rain carried by sharp winter winds. Clara finished another exhausting shift, wrapped her worn coat tightly around herself, and walked the familiar route back to her apartment on 43rd Street. The neighborhood looked unusually quiet. Streetlights flickered weakly against the falling rain while icy gusts rattled loose windows throughout the aging apartment buildings. As she climbed the narrow staircase leading to her floor, an uneasy feeling settled deep inside her stomach. Something was wrong. The hallway seemed darker than usual. The overhead light bulb that normally buzzed above her doorway had been deliberately smashed, leaving only scattered shards of glass beneath her boots. She slipped her apartment key into the lock but hesitated before opening the door. Years of enduring cruelty had sharpened her instincts. Before she could react, a massive hand clamped tightly across her mouth while another forcefully shoved her inside the apartment. The door slammed shut behind her with a heavy thud, cutting off every possibility of escape. When Clara spun around, she immediately recognized Liam O'Connor despite the fresh scar running across his temple where her handbag had struck him weeks earlier. Standing beside him was another towering enforcer whose face she had never seen before. Both men carried weapons, their expressions filled with cold satisfaction rather than anger. "So the famous waitress finally came home," Liam sneered, wiping rainwater from his leather jacket. "Gallagher sends his regards." Clara refused to answer, carefully measuring the distance between herself and the nearest object that could become a weapon. The second man laughed quietly before speaking. "Relax. This isn't really about you. You're just the bait." Liam slowly removed a revolver from beneath his coat and pointed it directly toward her chest. "Russo's going to come running the second he hears you're screaming. When he walks through that door, both of you die." For a split second, genuine fear tightened Clara's chest. Not because she believed Dominic would rescue her, but because she understood these men had already decided neither of them would survive the night. Unfortunately for them, Clara had spent an entire lifetime refusing to become anyone's victim. When Liam shoved her toward the center of the apartment, expecting her heavier frame to lose balance, he made a fatal mistake. Instead of falling, Clara planted both feet firmly against the floor and used his momentum against him. In one explosive motion, she ripped her oversized leather handbag from her shoulder and swung it with every ounce of strength she possessed. The thick brass buckle smashed directly into Liam's injured temple. Bone cracked beneath the impact as he staggered backward, dropping his revolver while clutching his bleeding head. The second attacker reacted, instantly charging toward Clara before she could recover. He wrapped powerful arms around her waist, attempting to wrestle her to the floor through sheer force. Most women would have collapsed beneath someone his size. Clara did the exact opposite. Digging her heels into the worn wooden floorboards, she shifted all 260 pounds of her weight backward with explosive determination. The enormous man slammed violently against the apartment wall. Old plaster burst apart while the cracked drywall caved inward beneath the collision. Air exploded from his lungs as Clara drove her elbow into his ribs again and again until he stumbled sideways in agony. For several precious seconds, she controlled the fight. Then Liam recovered. Roaring with fury, he grabbed a heavy floor lamp and swung it across the room. The steel base crashed into Clara's shoulder with enough force to send unbearable pain shooting through her entire arm. She dropped onto one knee, gasping as numbness spread through her fingers. Her vision blurred while Liam retrieved his fallen pistol and slowly aimed it toward her forehead. "No more clever jokes," he growled. "This is where the story ends." His finger tightened around the trigger. A suppressed gunshot echoed through the apartment. Liam's expression froze in confusion before his body collapsed sideways onto the kitchen floor. Standing inside the shattered doorway was Dominic Russo. Rain poured from his charcoal overcoat while blood soaked through the left side of his white dress shirt. His breathing came in short, uneven bursts, and the pistol in his hand trembled almost imperceptibly. It took Clara only a single glance to realize something terrible had happened before he reached her apartment. Victor and Leo were nowhere in sight. Dominic had come alone. The remaining assassin hesitated for only an instant before charging Dominic with a switchblade. Dominic attempted to raise his weapon again, but his injured body betrayed him. Another gunshot had already torn through his side outside the building during Gallagher's coordinated ambush. Blood loss slowed every movement. Before he could fire, the assassin slammed into him, sending both men crashing into the narrow hallway. Dominic's pistol skidded across the floor while the attacker pinned him against the wall and raised the knife toward his throat. For the first time since Clara had met him, Dominic Russo looked genuinely helpless. Without thinking, Clara launched herself forward. She did not search for another weapon because she already possessed one. Using every ounce of strength stored within her powerful frame, she charged into the attacker like a freight train. Her shoulders struck his chest with devastating force, lifting him completely away from Dominic. The two crashed across the apartment before slamming directly into the ancient cast-iron radiator that her landlord had refused to repair for months. Rusted pipes groaned under the impact before snapping apart with a deafening crack. Scalding water exploded outward in every direction, blasting the attacker's face with pressurized steam. He screamed in agony, blindly clawing toward the apartment door, before stumbling down the staircase and disappearing into the storm. Silence finally settled over the ruined apartment. Only the hiss of escaping steam and Dominic's ragged breathing filled the room. Clara turned toward him just as he slowly slid down the wall, one hand pressed desperately against his bleeding side. Blood seeped rapidly between his fingers, staining the expensive fabric of his suit almost black beneath the dim hallway light. "You," Dominic whispered through clenched teeth. "You just saved me." Clara knelt beside him without answering. For one brief moment, she considered standing up, walking away, and leaving the man who had spent weeks humiliating her to face the consequences of his own violent world. No one would blame her. In many ways, he deserved exactly that fate. Yet Clara had never allowed hatred to decide who she became. Removing a clean dish towel from her kitchen, she pressed it firmly against Dominic's wound despite his immediate cry of pain. "Hold this," she ordered. Dominic obeyed without argument. It was the first time Clara had ever seen the feared kingpin accept instructions from anyone. Supporting nearly all of his weight across her shoulders, she slowly pulled him to his feet. Every step toward the stairwell became an exhausting struggle as Dominic drifted in and out of consciousness. Normally, he towered above everyone around him, radiating absolute control. Now he leaned almost entirely against Clara, trusting the woman he had once mocked to keep him alive. Somehow she managed to guide him into his armored vehicle waiting behind the building, before speeding toward one of Russo's hidden safe houses overlooking the Gold Coast. Victor and Leo arrived only minutes later, both bruised from the earlier ambush but alive. A discreet physician was already waiting inside the luxurious penthouse. While armed guards secured every entrance, the doctor immediately carried Dominic into a private bedroom and began removing the bullet lodged dangerously close to his ribs. Clara remained alone in the elegant living room, exhausted beyond words. Her clothes were torn. Her shoulder burned with every movement. Dried blood covered her hands, some belonging to her, most belonging to Dominic. Outside, dawn slowly approached over the Chicago skyline. She considered slipping away before anyone noticed. She had enough savings for a bus ticket back to Ohio. She could disappear forever. No more Mafia wars. No more Dominic Russo. No more danger. Yet every time she stood to leave, she found herself sitting back down. Something inside refused to abandon a man whose life now rested partly because of her choices. Nearly 2 hours later, the bedroom door finally opened. Dominic stepped into the room wearing only dark trousers and fresh bandages wrapped tightly around his torso. His face remained pale from blood loss, but his eyes were clearer than Clara had ever seen them. "The doctor says you saved my life," he said quietly. Clara folded her arms. "You returned the favor." Dominic slowly crossed the room until they stood only a few feet apart. "I've commanded hundreds of men," he admitted. "I've trusted soldiers, bodyguards, and killers. Tonight, every one of them failed me." His voice lowered almost to a whisper. "But you didn't." He looked directly into Clara's eyes. "The woman I spent weeks trying to humiliate fought harder for my life than anyone who has ever sworn loyalty to me." Silence lingered between them before Dominic finally asked the question that had haunted him since waking. "Why?" "You had every reason to leave me there." Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "Because I'm not you." Dominic frowned. "I don't decide whether someone deserves help based on whether they've been kind to me." She took one slow step closer. "You think strength comes from making people afraid. You believe power means forcing everyone else to kneel." Her voice remained calm but unwavering. "I don't. I saved you because I refuse to let bullies decide what kind of person I become." She paused before delivering the words that struck Dominic harder than any bullet ever could. "I won't let Gallagher win. And I won't become someone who walks away while another human being dies." For the first time in many years, Dominic Russo found himself completely speechless. Everything he believed about power, respect, and strength had been shattered not by another crime boss, politician, or billionaire, but by the fearless waitress he had once dismissed as weak. In risking her own life to save his, Clara had accomplished what no enemy ever could. She had broken the arrogance of the most feared man in Chicago and forced him to confront a truth he had spent his entire life avoiding. Genuine strength had never belonged to the person holding the gun. It belonged to the one who still chose compassion when hatred would have been easier. Dominic had survived bullets, betrayals, and wars that had reduced stronger men to frightened shadows, yet nothing had unsettled him as deeply as Clara's final words. Long after she finished speaking, he remained motionless in the center of the penthouse, his bandaged side throbbing with every breath. The physical pain barely registered. What tormented him was the memory of her kneeling beside him in that ruined apartment, pressing a towel against his wound while blood soaked through her hands. She had possessed every reason to abandon him. He had humiliated her in public, treated her body as a weapon against her, and repeatedly tried to crush the dignity she had spent a lifetime defending. Still, when his life hung by a thread, she chose to save him. That truth stripped away every excuse he had built around his behavior. For years, Dominic had convinced himself that cruelty was simply another form of control. He believed fear kept people loyal, humiliation, exposed weakness, and power belonged to whoever could force the room into silence. No one had ever challenged those beliefs and survived long enough to make him question them. Clara had done more than survive. She had looked directly at the ugliness inside him and refused to imitate it. As the first pale light of morning spread across the Chicago skyline, Dominic lowered himself carefully into a chair across from her. He studied the bruising already darkening her shoulder, the small cuts on her hands, and the exhaustion beneath her eyes. She had been injured because of a conflict connected to him, yet she sat with her spine straight and her expression guarded as though she expected nothing from the man whose life she had preserved. "I remember everything I said to you," Dominic began quietly. Clara gave a humorless laugh. "That must be a long list." He accepted the remark without anger. "I called you names because I knew they would hurt. I made jokes about your body in front of strangers. I used my position to make sure you could not avoid me." His jaw tightened with visible shame. "I told myself it was entertainment. It wasn't." Clara watched him carefully but offered no comfort. Dominic continued. "It was cowardice." The word seemed foreign in his mouth. No one had ever heard Dominic Russo describe himself that way. He had built his identity around invulnerability. Yet the truth now stood too clearly before him to deny. "I saw how people looked at you," he said. "I understood where the wounds were, and I aimed directly at them because I wanted a reaction." "You wanted me to feel small," Clara replied. "Yes." The honesty surprised them both. Clara slowly rose from the sofa despite the pain in her shoulder. Standing gave her a sense of control she refused to surrender. "You didn't just want a reaction," she said. "You wanted proof that your power worked on everyone." Dominic's gaze followed her. "You thought I was a target because I didn't fit into the world you created. Everyone around you is polished, obedient, and terrified of saying the wrong thing. Then I walked up to your table wearing an apron that didn't hide my body, and I treated you like a customer instead of a king." He did not interrupt. "You looked at me and decided I needed to be corrected," Clara continued. "Not because I had done anything to you, but because I didn't lower my head." Each sentence forced him deeper into memories he now wished he could erase. The overflowing water glass. The gym brochure. The cruel remarks delivered loudly enough for other diners to hear. At the time, he had interpreted her defiance as disrespect. Now he understood it had been self-preservation. "You're right," Dominic said. "I wanted to put you in your place." Clara's expression hardened. "And where was that supposed to be?" "Beneath me." The admission hung between them with brutal clarity. Dominic looked away for the first time. "I have spent most of my life surrounded by people who tell me what they think I want to hear. My employees praise decisions they hate. Politicians laugh at jokes they don't find funny. Women pretend to admire me because they want protection, status, or money. Even the men I trust measure every word because they know what happens when I'm disappointed." His voice grew more distant as he spoke, as though he were seeing his own life from outside it. "Everyone bows before I ask. Everyone lies before I question them." Then he looked back at Clara. "You never did." Clara remained silent. "You looked me in the eye from the beginning," he continued. "You saw exactly what I was and refused to pretend otherwise. You weren't impressed by the suit, the restaurant, the cars, or the men carrying guns behind me. I could have placed a fortune on that table and you still would have told me when I was acting like a bastard. I probably would have used the money to pay my mother's medical bills first," Clara said dryly. "Then I would have told you." A faint smile almost reached Dominic's face, but the weight of the conversation prevented it from lasting. "That is exactly what I mean." He slowly stood careful not to tear the stitches beneath his bandages. "At first I wanted to break you because your honesty made me uncomfortable. I needed to prove you were no different from everyone else. I thought if I embarrassed you enough, threatened you enough, or made your job difficult enough, eventually you would become afraid." Clara folded her arms. "And when I didn't, I became obsessed with finding the point where you would." He stepped toward the windows, staring down at the city he controlled through fear. "Every time you fought back, I told myself the next insult would do it. Then you answered with something sharper. I used money and you mocked it. I used authority, and you treated it like a costume. I bought the restaurant because I thought owning your workplace would finally remind you who held the power." Dominic turned to face her again. "But the more pressure I placed on you, the stronger you became." His voice softened. "I began waiting for your replies. I noticed when you entered the room. I knew the sound of your footsteps before I saw you. I watched you carry trays heavier than some men could manage and comfort customers who never bothered to ask whether you were tired." Clara's expression shifted slightly, though her defenses remained intact. Dominic moved closer, but he stopped at a respectful distance instead of invading her space. I saw how your coworkers trusted you. I saw you give part of your tips to a busboy whose child was sick. I saw you take phone calls from your mother in the storage room, then return to work pretending you weren't worried. Clara's eyes narrowed. You had me watched. No, he answered immediately. I watched you. The distinction did little to ease her suspicion, but there was no pride in his admission. I noticed everything because I could not understand you, Dominic said. You had less money than anyone at my table, fewer choices, and more reasons to be bitter. Yet you possessed something none of us had. What? Integrity. The word landed with unexpected tenderness. You never used your pain as permission to become cruel. Clara looked away, uncomfortable with the sincerity in his voice. Dominic allowed the silence to settle before continuing. The night Gallagher's men attacked you, I thought I was coming to save someone I considered mine. Her head snapped toward him. I am not yours. I know. His answer came without hesitation. That belief was part of the arrogance I'm trying to confront. I thought protecting you gave me a claim over you. Then I ended up bleeding on your floor and you became the one keeping me alive. You owed me nothing. You could have walked away and been free of me forever. His eyes lowered to the bandage across his ribs. But you stayed. Because leaving you to die would have changed me, Clara said. It would have made me carry your darkness. Dominic absorbed the statement in silence. That is what I cannot stop thinking about, he finally said. Your strength isn't only in the way you fought those men. It's in the fact that you still knew who you were afterward. He studied her openly now, but the contempt that once defined his gaze had disappeared. His eyes moved over the broad line of her shoulders, the powerful shape of her body, and the curves he had once used as material for ridicule. For the first time, he saw no flaw requiring correction. He saw evidence of endurance. The body he had mocked had absorbed attacks that might have killed someone else. It had carried his weight down a staircase, kept pressure on his wound, and refused to collapse even when pain demanded it. You called me disgusting without using that exact word, Clara said, recognizing the change in his expression. You compared me to things designed to make people laugh. You made sure every person in that restaurant understood that you considered my body an embarrassment. Dominic flinched as though she had struck him. I remember. Do you? Her voice sharpened. Because admiration after I save your life does not erase humiliation before it. You don't get to look at me differently now and expect the past to disappear. I don't expect it to. Then don't romanticize what you did. The warning stopped him. Clara stepped closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. You did not torment me because you secretly cared. You did it because you were arrogant, cruel, and used to treating people as objects. Attraction does not excuse abuse. Dominic's face tightened, but he did not defend himself. You're right. I need you to understand that, she said. Not say it because you think it is what I want to hear. I understand. You are beginning to. The correction was deliberate. Dominic accepted it. Clara slowly paced across the room, gathering the thoughts she had held back for weeks. You called me strong only after my strength benefited you. Before that, it threatened you. You are admiring the same qualities you tried to destroy. The shame in his eyes deepened. I was too blinded by my own pride to recognize them. No, you recognized them immediately. Clara stopped and turned. That was why you attacked them. Dominic had no answer because she had uncovered the truth he had been circling around since the moment they met. Her confidence had not been invisible to him. It had provoked him precisely because he saw it so clearly. Yes, he admitted. I knew you were strong. I hated that I could not control it. The room grew quiet again. Dominic took a careful breath. You are not beautiful because you saved me, he said. You were beautiful when you stood beside my table and refused to look away. I was simply too arrogant to call strength beautiful unless it obeyed me. Clara's expression softened for only a heartbeat. He continued before courage failed him. You are a queen, Clara. She raised one eyebrow. I don't need a crown from you. I know. His voice remained steady. And you are a warrior not because you fought my enemies, but because you survived people like me without allowing us to define you. The words were sincere, but Clara refused to let them carry her toward easy forgiveness. Pretty speeches are cheap, Dominic. I know. You have access to every luxury in this city. You can buy restaurants, silence witnesses, and make powerful men return your calls in the middle of the night. Words cost you nothing. What would cost enough? The question was not defensive. It sounded almost desperate. Clara studied him for a long moment. Change. Dominic remained still. Not for one night, she added. Not until I stop being angry. Not until you get what you want. She gestured toward the city beyond the windows. You cannot apologize to me while continuing to humiliate everyone else. You cannot call me a queen and treat your employees like servants. You cannot claim you respect my courage while demanding fear from every person around you. His instinct was to argue that fear kept him alive, but the objection died before reaching his lips. Clara noticed. That is what real change will require, she said. You will have to question the beliefs that built your entire life. Dominic glanced toward the closed bedroom door where the doctor had removed Gallagher's bullet only hours earlier. My world does not forgive weakness. Respect is not weakness. In my world, they are often treated as the same thing. Then your world is broken. Her response came without hesitation. Dominic considered the empire he had created. It functioned through obedience, secrecy, and punishment. Until Clara, he had never imagined another way to maintain authority. You are asking me to become a different man, he said. No. She held his gaze. I am asking you to decide whether the man you are now deserves anyone's trust. The distinction struck him deeply. Clara moved toward the sofa and picked up her damaged coat. Dominic instinctively stepped forward to help her, then stopped himself. Even that small hesitation showed he was beginning to recognize boundaries he had once ignored. Where are you going? He asked. Home. Your apartment is destroyed. Then I'll stay with a friend. I can arrange a suite here, a separate floor, security outside the door. Clara shook her head. This is what I'm talking about. Your first solution is always control. I'm trying to protect you. You can offer protection without deciding for me. Dominic paused. What do you want? It was the first time he had asked the question without already believing he knew the answer. I want Victor to take me somewhere I choose, Clara replied. I want no guards following me unless I agree. I want my apartment repaired, not replaced with a luxury cage. And I want the restaurant staff treated fairly now that you own the place. Dominic nodded slowly. Done. No. Clara's tone stopped him again. Not done because I commanded you, and not done because you are trying to impress me. Think about why those things should have happened without me asking. He lowered his gaze. I will. She moved toward the private elevator, but Dominic spoke before the doors opened. Clara. She looked back. I don't know when admiration became something more, he said. Perhaps it began the night you poured water over my suit. Perhaps it was every time you refused to let me decide how you should feel about yourself. His voice grew quieter. But I know what I feel now. Clara waited without moving. I love you. The confession did not sound triumphant. It carried no expectation, only vulnerability. Clara absorbed the words before answering. You do not know how to love me yet. The statement wounded him more deeply than rejection would have. You know how to want me, she continued. You know how to admire me now that you have seen what I can do. Love requires respect when I disappoint you, disagree with you, or walk away from you. Dominic's face remained composed, but the truth in her words shook him. I can learn. Then learn without expecting a reward. The elevator doors opened. Clara stepped inside and turned to face him. You cannot buy my trust. You cannot threaten me into giving it. You cannot protect me so aggressively that protection becomes another prison. Dominic stood alone beneath the cold light of the penthouse, stripped of every weapon he normally used to get what he wanted. What can I do? He asked. Clara held his gaze as the doors began to close. Become someone who understands why I should be free to say no. Then she disappeared from view. Dominic remained where she had left him long after the elevator descended. For the first time in his life, he possessed no strategy, no command, and no amount of money capable of guaranteeing victory. If he wanted Clara's trust, he would have to earn it without forcing the outcome. He would need to surrender the arrogance that had protected him for years and face the damage created by his own choices. Loving her would not mean claiming her, rescuing her, or placing her above everyone else while continuing to rule through cruelty. It would mean respecting the strength that existed entirely beyond his control. That realization terrified Dominic more than any rival syndicate ever had. It also gave him the first honest reason he had ever found to change. Dominic stood alone in the silence of his office, long after everyone else had left, staring at the city lights that had once made him feel untouchable. For the first time in his life, power no longer brought him comfort. He had spent years believing respect could be bought with money, enforced with violence, or demanded through fear. Yet the one woman he had tried hardest to break had shown him that true strength could never be taken away. Every cruel word he had thrown at Clara echoed in his mind, especially the day he had forced her to kneel, convinced that humiliating her would prove his dominance. Instead, that memory became the greatest source of shame he had ever carried. When he finally found Clara, she was closing the restaurant after another long day. She looked at him without fear and without expectation, simply waiting to see whether he had come to issue another command or create another wound. Dominic walked toward her slowly, every step heavier than the last. His injuries from the recent battle had not fully healed, and each movement sent sharp pain through his body, but none of it compared to the weight of his guilt. He stopped a few feet away, took a deep breath, and faced the choice that had haunted him for days: cling to the pride that had defined his entire life, or become the man Clara deserved to see. Without another word, he lowered himself to one knee. The damaged muscles in his legs screamed in protest, sweat forming across his forehead, but he refused to stand again. The feared Mafia boss, who had never bowed to another living soul, remained kneeling before the woman he had once tried to destroy. Clara's eyes widened, not because she wanted revenge, but because she understood how impossible this moment was for a man like him. Dominic looked up at her, his voice stripped of authority for the first time. He admitted that he had been wrong in every way that truly mattered. He apologized for mocking her appearance, for treating her kindness as weakness, for trying to destroy her confidence so she would become dependent on him, and for believing that fear could replace love. He did not offer excuses, blame his upbringing, or hide behind the brutal rules of the criminal world. Every choice had been his own, and every scar he had left on her heart belonged to him alone. Then he said the words Clara had never expected to hear. She had never belonged to him. She was not a possession to control, a prize to win, or a life to command. She was her own person, and he had never had the right to decide her future. He knew forgiveness could not erase the past, and he did not ask her to pretend that it could. Instead, he promised that if she allowed him to remain in her life, he would earn every ounce of trust through his actions rather than his promises. Clara remained silent for several moments, studying every expression on his face. She had learned long ago that real remorse revealed itself in humility, not dramatic speeches. The man kneeling before her no longer resembled the arrogant crime boss who had believed the world existed to serve him. Yet she also refused to let emotion erase wisdom. Finally, she told him to stand, not because he had earned redemption, but because she would not become the kind of person who demanded humiliation in return for the humiliation she had suffered. She accepted his apology, but she made it clear that forgiveness was only the beginning, never the destination. Love would not return simply because he had finally spoken the right words. If he truly wanted a place beside her, he would have to prove that his transformation could survive beyond a single emotional moment. Clara laid out clear boundaries that neither wealth nor power could erase. Dominic would treat every employee at the restaurant with dignity regardless of their position. He would pay fairly, listen before giving orders, and never again use fear to command loyalty. He would repair the apartment that had been damaged because of the violence surrounding his world, but he would never use money as a way to control her choices. If she accepted help, it would be because she chose, not because she owed him anything. Most importantly, he would respect her independence even when it meant accepting decisions he did not like. Dominic agreed without hesitation. For the first time, obedience did not feel like weakness but like responsibility. Over the following weeks, those around him began witnessing changes they would once have considered impossible. Members of his organization noticed that punishments became rarer while fairness became the new standard. He demanded discipline without cruelty, rewarded loyalty without manipulation, and reminded his men that respect could never be forced at gunpoint. Rumors quickly spread throughout the city's underworld that Dominic Moretti was no longer ruling through terror alone. Some interpreted his transformation as weakness. Others quietly realized it required far greater courage to change than to remain feared forever. The greatest challenge, however, still waited in the shadows. Declan Gallagher had no intention of allowing Dominic's organization to recover. The Irish mob prepared one final strike, convinced that Dominic's recent injuries and apparent compassion had made him vulnerable. This time, Clara refused to remain behind locked doors while others fought for her future. She studied Gallagher's financial network, uncovered the hidden routes used to move illegal shipments, and discovered the location of the meeting where the rival leaders planned to unite. Her intelligence accomplished what brute force never could. Together, she and Dominic built a strategy that relied on planning rather than reckless violence. During the final confrontation, Gallagher underestimated Clara exactly as Dominic once had. While Gallagher focused all his attention on eliminating Dominic, Clara exposed his betrayal to his own allies by revealing evidence that he had secretly been sacrificing their interests to protect himself. Distrust spread through the Irish ranks within minutes, breaking the unity that had made them dangerous. Dominic defeated Gallagher's remaining loyal men, but it was Clara's courage and clear thinking that shattered the empire from within. When the battle finally ended, Dominic refused to take the credit. Standing before his own soldiers, he publicly acknowledged that their victory belonged to both of them. He introduced Clara not as someone under his protection, but as his equal, the woman whose wisdom had saved countless lives and whose strength had changed him more than any enemy ever could. His men lowered their heads not because Dominic ordered them to, but because they genuinely respected her. Months later, life no longer revolved around survival alone. The restaurant flourished, the neighborhood slowly healed, and Dominic continued reforming both his business and the organization that had once thrived on fear. Clara remained exactly who she had always been, independent, compassionate, and impossible to control. She challenged Dominic whenever he slipped into old habits, and instead of resisting, he listened. Their relationship grew not from dependency but from mutual respect, earned one choice at a time. On quiet evenings, they often stood together overlooking the city that had nearly destroyed them both. Dominic no longer stood ahead of Clara as someone who claimed ownership over her future, nor did Clara hide behind him as someone waiting to be rescued. They stood shoulder to shoulder, facing whatever tomorrow might bring as equal partners. In the end, Clara's greatest victory was never winning the heart of the city's most powerful mafia boss. Her true triumph was protecting her dignity when every force around her tried to take it away. Dominic's greatest achievement was not defeating rival gangs or expanding his empire, but finding the courage to admit his failures and become a better man. Their story became proof that real strength is never measured by money, weapons, or the fear one can inspire in others. True power begins with self-respect, grows through accountability, and reaches its greatest form when we recognize the value of another human being as an equal.